Real quick before we get into the video, next month I'm starting a supporter drive so I can keep making videos like these without having to sell you time-specific grooming kits or geometry-themed websites. So instead I thought, why not just advertise the channel? But if you look at my subscriptions, you might realize I'm pretty terrible at selling myself. So I figured, why not ask you instead? If you're interested in helping out, all you have to do is tell others why you enjoy the channel and why you feel it's worth supporting. Use your own words, be serious, funny, punny, talk about your favorite videos, make a meme, be brutally honest. Do it however you want. I'll highlight some of my favorite ones instead of running ads in my upcoming videos. I figure it's going to mean more coming from you than from me. You can find out more details in my update video for April. Thanks in advance for your help, and I hope you enjoy the video. Have you ever had one of those times where you feel like you're reliving a moment you've experienced before? Never in my life have I expected to hear conversations talking about Resident Evil 2 in the exact same ways I've heard over 20 years ago. I have never thought I would be hearing people talk about how scary the new Resident Evil game is, or how much fun it was. I never thought I would see glowing reviews or fan reverence in a survival horror game again, or articles about its breakout success. Simply put, I have a serious case of deja vu. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to play the remake yet. The footage you see here is most likely stolen from some other YouTuber who probably won't notice.
If you have yet to play this game, stop this video right now and remedy that, because you are honestly missing out on one of the best games I have played in years.
But it is an experience I'm looking forward to when I have the chance. However, before Resident Evil 2 released to critical acclaim, there was a game that came before it. This game would serve as inspiration to the game we know and love today. It was what allowed developers to fully understand what survival horror was. While it wasn't perfect, and you can make plenty of critiques against it, the truth is, if it wasn't for this game, we wouldn't have Resident Evil 2. Of course, I'm obviously talking about Resident Evil 2. However, before Resident Evil 2 released to critical acclaim, there was a game that came before it. This game would serve as the inspiration to the game that we know and love today. In a way, it was what allowed the developers to fully understand what survival horror was. While it wasn't perfect and one can make plenty of critiques against it, the truth is, if it wasn't for this game, we wouldn't have had Resident Evil 2. Of course, I'm obviously talking about Resident Evil 2. Or, at least, that's what it would have been called. This is Design Documentaries, an in-depth look at a game's design, history, and legacy. And today, we're talking about Resident Evil 2, or as it's now known as, Resident Evil 1.5. Back when Resident Evil 1 released in 1996, what started as a spiritual successor of a fairly obscure NES RPG horror game ended up being a surprising and massive success for Capcom. Resident Evil sold well over 2 million copies with its original release, and over 5 million if you take all versions into consideration. It gave birth to a franchise that was not only one of Capcom's most well-known and successful, but it popularized survival horror, a genre that would go on to define the 5th and 6th console generations. So it pretty much goes without saying that of course Capcom was going to make a sequel. After the original Resident Evil's success, Shinji Mikami was promoted from game designer to game producer. Though titles are pretty fluid from company to company, the role of producer would have given Mikami more control over the game's direction, not just in design but other aspects as well, such as how the game's budgeted or its marketing. This meant Mikami's director's seat was left open and he would have to choose someone to fill it, so he decided to hand the reins over to someone he had worked with on the original Resident Evil, system planner Hideki Kamiya. At the time, Kamiya wasn't the most experienced director. Besides Resident Evil, he only had one other game under his belt, a Japanese-only Incredible Machine clone that used ghouls and ghost characters, which now that I see it, I kind of want to play it. It looks just weird enough to be up my alley. Anyway, this was a pre-Devil May Cry / Okami / Bayonetta Kamiya. He had only been at Capcom for 3 years, and this was his first time in the director's chair. And perhaps his inexperience was the reason that Mikami had put him in charge of the sequel. According to Kamiya, Mr. Mikami often said to me, "There are a lot of reliable planners out there, but you're a dark horse who will either make a hit or a miss." So perhaps Mr. Mikami gambled that I would make a hit. Which, to be fair, is extremely accurate for most of Hideki Kamiya's career. It's fair to say that Hideki Kamiya definitely has a different style than Mikami. In a sense of irony, Kamiya said that he hates horror. "I hate horror movies, I hate zombies, I hate all that stuff. It's scary, I don't watch it, I'm not a fan of it." This is a view he still carries today, by the way. This is likely why Kamiya had always leaned more towards action. Remember that Devil May Cry was originally meant to be a Resident Evil game at some point, which is possibly another reason why Shinji Mikami had chosen him for the director. From Mikami's perspective, he wanted a sequel to be different than the original game. He felt that if people became too accustomed to how the game played or the kind of scares it had, it simply wouldn't be scary anymore. Instead, he wanted Kamiya to express his own brand of survival horror. That's not to say there wasn't a bit of contention between the two. Mikami's style could often be described as a slow burn, focusing on the fear of the unknown and of surprise, and most importantly, the anticipation of fear that never comes. Insert plug of my Resident Evil jump scare video here. Oh, shit. The original Resident Evil focused on making resources seem scarce, which worked well for survival horror, though that idea didn't exactly come from Mikami. We'll get into that later. Kamiya's style ended up being more revealing to the player, often filled with more action and fighting against more powerful enemies and more of them. Throughout development, the two disagreed on how things should have been handled. However, Mikami realized by taking a more active role in the game's direction, he was taking away Kamiya's agency with the game. I think games should have a creator's taste, and that is to make every game different and fun to play. In a moment of introspection, Mikami realized that he's the kind of person to tell the producer, "Leave the game development to us and just count money." And with him now in the producer's chair, he decided the best course of action was just to step back. Shinji Mikami asked the team to show him a ROM about once a month, but left development completely to Kamiya. And it would be this decision and these ROMs that would make for an interesting piece of gaming history nearly 2 decades later. Development of Resident Evil 2 started only months after the release of the original game, with the development team expanding to over 50 people, consisting of a mix of those who had worked on the original and some of those who had never worked on a game before. The team had worked diligently for a release date of May 1997, giving the sequel about a year in development time. However, the project was delayed again and again until it was released on January 21st, 1998. For many, that's all there was to the story, or that's at least how it appeared on the surface. But if you were following the development closely, you would have seen that the Resident Evil 2 that we got wasn't quite the Resident Evil 2 that was being shown. The thing to note that these previews weren't quite your typical prototype or beta footage, at least not traditionally. Yes, how a game looks at the start of development isn't usually indicative of the final product, but more often than not, it will at least resemble what hits retail. However, this version seemed drastically different than what was in the final release. It would later be told through interviews and articles that this version of Resident Evil 2 had been scrapped at some point in development. This version of the game was said to be somewhere between 60 and 80% complete before they decided to move on to what would actually be Resident Evil 2. This version of the game would commonly be referred to as Resident Evil 1.5, as a way of designating where it took place in the series' development. There were other Resident Evil projects before 1.5 that never saw the light of day, such as a pitched concept that sounded a lot like Resident Evil in Space, which might have been an inspiration to Dino Crisis 3, or a mode where you play as a zombie, which was later featured in Resident Evil Outbreak. But more fleshed Fleshed out ideas were like Biohazard Dash or Resident Evil 1.25. Less discussed than Resident Evil 1.5, Biohazard Dash was pitched as a pseudo-sequel or spin-off. It would have taken place 3 years after the original game, with Chris and Jill investigating the remains of the Spencer Mansion. Except this time, the zombies have combined with the flora and created a plant-like hybrid. Not much is known about this version because outside of a little bit of concept art and a couple of very obscure interviews, there isn't much information. Some believe that it was the first idea of a sequel before 1.5, some think it was meant to be a spin-off of the Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil, some believe that it never existed at all, a made-up game over a mistranslation turned into a creepypasta. Though, thanks to an interview translated by Shmuplations, it seemed that it was most likely a concept idea that was meant to be in Resident Evil 1.5 that was never realized. Resident Evil 1.5, on the other hand, we have a ton of information about. Well, in comparison anyway. Definitely more than other early versions of games at the time. Again, Resident Evil 1.5 was meant to be the actual Resident Evil 2, and all things considered had more time in development. Capcom went all out showing the development of the game as part of its marketing. As a result, it ended up showing it off to various gaming magazines and at events like the Tokyo Game Show and E3, displaying different concepts, assets, and mechanics in order to build hype. And what we seen was completely different than the version we got, in a lot of ways. One of the most obvious is just how the game looks. Resident Evil 1.5 looks much different than the final product. They both start with the Raccoon City Police Department, but it's almost a literal night and day difference. The museum turned police station in the final was originally designed to have a more modern office building look, complete with a more natural layout regarding room placement. Even on an aesthetic level, it looks different. There is a very apparent dark blue theme that makes every room look cold and claustrophobic, compared to the warm tones and dilapidated look of RE2. Likewise, the character models might not be the same you remember. In this version, there is no Claire Redfield. The female protagonist in 1.5 was Elza Walker, a motorcyclist who came to Raccoon City for college just in time for a zombie outbreak to occur. Leon at least looks familiar. While he doesn't have quite the same textures, it's very similar to the final look. Or would, but that really depends on how early you're looking. Earlier in development, Leon looked a lot different with a more muscular build, a short sleeved shirt, and darker hair. Before that, he wasn't even going to be called Leon. Instead, he was going to be called Grant Bittman, which is about the most 90s name for a protagonist in a zombie game before Sega's Zombie Hunters Stick Brightling. All that's interesting, but it's mostly surface level stuff. What's more fascinating is the game that it could have been. A lot of stuff did find its way into Resident Evil 2, but there's also a lot of things that didn't, or at least didn't until 22 years later. Granted, it's very difficult to speak on any sort of authority regarding this, because most likely there were very few people who were able to see the final product. And I'm not just referencing the 240p footage. During that time, very few people had a chance to play these preview demos, and most information at the time was speculative anyway. Moreover, even though Resident Evil 1.5 had been close to completion, there were still a lot of concepts and ideas not implemented. Most of what we know about the game only came out from various interviews after the release of RE2. So while this is by no means a full picture, it's a good idea of what could have been, or at least my interpretation. First off, let's talk about the narrative. In Resident Evil 2, well, the actual released version of Resident Evil 2, after the mansion incident, the STARS team had attempted to warn the city about the pharmaceutical corporation's evil ongoings at the residence. However, due to some wisely spent hush money and the fact that Umbrella owned half the town, the company didn't suffer a lot of repercussions. The zombie outbreak that occurred in Raccoon City was incidental. Umbrella was trying to pull out of the city as well as obtain a sample of a new virus, when an incident occurred that caused the sample to leak into the sewer, causing the virus to be spread by rats. Resident Evil 1.5 ends up being some sort of strange alternative universe where Chris and Jill's allegations were taken seriously. and the Raccoon City Police Department staged a raid on Umbrella headquarters. But during that time, the flesh-decaying virus was released into the city, and now your goal is to escape from the city. 1.5's narrative is very straightforward and was effectively a retread on the original game's story. There were two characters, namely Leon, S. Kennedy and Elza Walker. And in typical Resident Evil fashion, they would have to find their way out of the situation by collecting progressively more powerful weapons and facing increasingly tougher enemies. Simply put, the narrative in 1.5 was sort of an afterthought, and there are more than a few reasons for this. For starters, Capcom didn't really invest a lot of time in storytelling. While Squaresoft was busy making games with a complex ensemble cast, exploring deep narrative themes, and making the best damn opera scene I ever experienced, Mega Man X2 was fighting Sigma again. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just that Capcom based their games off of mechanics and concepts, and stories were often filler. Another one of the main reasons was due to the fact that Shinji Mikami effectively wanted RE2 to be the last game in the series. And he wanted a story that would conclude everything set up by the original Resident Evil, which meant the destruction of Umbrella. There are some interesting things about this version though, especially if you're familiar with Resident Evil 2. Leon's story has no mention of him being a rookie cop on the first day of the job. He instead would have been one of the few remaining police officers trying to secure a means of escape, which initially doesn't go so well. His scenario starting off by witnessing his escape helicopter crashing somewhere in the city. Though other concepts would not see him start off in the police station, but arriving there in his civilian attire, something that wouldn't be featured until the remake of Resident Evil 2. He would have teamed up with Marvin, who would have had a bigger role than he did in the full release, and accompanied Leon throughout the game. Brian Irons is also here, but instead of being a corrupt, sadistic police chief, he would have taken the role that Marvin would have played as the injured cop, who would later sacrifice himself at some point. On their journey, they would have found a scientist named Linda Wong, who ends up looking a lot like Ada Wong and ends up running ahead a lot like Ada, so you can kind of tell this was a prototype of Ada, though it would be kind of uncanny that after all this time to hear Leon say, "Linda, wait!" instead. Their journey would end up taking them through a warehouse district, some sewers, and ultimately the Umbrella Research Facility, that looks very similar to the one that we would see in the final release. Meanwhile, Elza Walker would also start at the police station, only this time crashing through the front door on her motorcycle. Unlike Claire, she isn't in town looking for her brother. Unfortunately, she would have arrived in Raccoon City just as the zombie outbreak had occurred. Instead of Marvin and Linda, Elza's story would have her work with a man named John, who looks suspiciously like Robert Kendo from Resident Evil 2. She would have found John in the holding cells at the police station after she was given a key by an officer named Roy, who would have been infected by the zombies, leading to a scene where John would have had to kill the zombified Roy. Is it really spoilers if the game didn't actually come out? Elza would also come across a little girl named Sherry Birkin, who, much like an official release, was being pursued by a giant monster, except is a little bit more vocal this time about who he is looking for. Elza would also come across the chief at some point, and their journey to escape would also take them to the Umbrella Research Facility. However, their stories wouldn't have crossed paths. The zapping system that was featured in Resident Evil 2, where one playthrough would have affected another character's story, shows no real signs of being implemented. Instead, the campaigns would have been separated like they were in Resident Evil 1, but not entirely separated. Both events would have happened around the same time. For example, Elza would have had to fight a mutated William Birkin as he arrives on the elevator, and how this guy used an elevator, I don't know. Meanwhile, Leon would have been ambushed by William in the same room, most likely after it was defeated by Elza. It's hard to tell just how connected these events would have been in the final release. This was around the time when the zapping system is said to have been conceived and they had started trying to implement its basic concepts. Though there are also interviews stating that the system was thought of during the original Resident Evil. And since the source of this information is from the same person, it's hard to tell what was a PR spin and what was the actual truth. From my guess, it was a concept figured late into 1.5's development and would later be implemented in RE2 from the beginning. Regardless, while the characters and stories might have been different, in the grand scheme of things, 1.5 ended up extremely close to what we'd have in RE2, especially if you consider the gameplay. For instance, the increase of enemies on screen. The original Resident Evil only had a maximum of, I believe it was 2 or 3 zombies on a screen at once. Resident Evil 1.5 could have an impressive 9 zombies on the screen, which ends up being 2 more than Resident Evil 2. And this was accomplished by lowering the polygon count used to make zombies. This meant that zombies could horde together, making them especially dangerous in groups. It was easier to be surrounded and more difficult to maneuver around, making zombies feel like a threat again, especially if you were familiar with the original Resident Evil. There are also more types of enemies. You still had the Cerberus, the spiders and crows, as well as 2 new ones. A fast and large powerful gorilla zombie, and these Spider-Men that look a lot like the Chimeras from the original. More interestingly, according to Mikami, supposedly the zombies were to change over the game as well. It was never clarified what exactly this means, whether we'd see a zombie evolve into other forms or just become tougher, but it's an interesting concept. One that might have inspired the concept of William's form constantly changing throughout the game. Which begs the question as to how exactly were you going to be able to handle that many zombies at once? Well, that's where the game's new weaponry comes into play. While the original had a variety of guns, and the sequel would include upgrades as well as a few more interesting weapons, Resident Evil 1.5 even had more than the game it would become. It featured 4 pistols, 2 of which would have had 3-round burst, 2 shotguns, a grenade launcher with its variety of ammunition, 2 different magnums, the return of the flamethrower, 2 machine guns, hand grenades, and even an upgrade to your melee weapon in the form of a steel pipe. What's the purpose of having so many different weapons? Well, Kamiya said mainly the staff thought it would be cool to have, so they put it in the game. But the new weapons, especially the machine guns and hand grenades, would have made fighting the hordes of zombies a lot more manageable. And it wasn't just offense that got an upgrade, but as you would progress through the game, your defensive options would receive a few upgrades as well. At certain sections of the game, you would have found body armor, which you would have been able to equip. These would not only increase your defense, but would also increase the amount of inventory slots that you had, much like the side pack did in Resident Evil 2. Allegedly, this wouldn't have always given you the defense bonus. As you would have taken damage, the armor would actually become damaged and bloodied. This could have served a similar purpose to the limping mechanic found in Resident Evil 2, so you could see your health without actually having to go into the menu. There were also hints that this meant the armor would have been less effective in defending against damage as well. Though, again, this is speculative, as there is really no telling if this would have survived in the final version of the game. There would have also been a lot of little changes from the staples found in RE1. For example, there are no herbs. The first aid spray makes a return, and even an antidote cousin, but the majority of your healing would have been done by medicine of the green, red, and blue variety. You can even still mix them, most likely to the same effects, though it looks like there would have been a green-green-red, green-green-blue, and green-red-red varieties, and it's hard to tell if there would have been different effects on these as well. You also won't find any typewriters either, now replaced by a more modern computer. And how you saved would have been handled by, of all things, a memory card. Even the environment seemed like it would have played a bigger part in 1.5. One of the things that didn't make it into the release version was the ability to use shutters to close off certain routes. One of the things that was shown off was the ability to cut a zombie in half using a shutter, which would have totally been 13-year-olds not in for mature SoberDwarf's favorite thing to do. But there was also the implication that you could use the environment to deal with zombies as opposed to just shooting and moving around them. Also, zombies could climb up on ledges. They had ledge climbing technology. They no longer had to barf in my general direction. All in all, there were a lot of interesting and great ideas found in 1.5 that wouldn't be found in the series until much later. More importantly, these minor gameplay changes definitely paints Resident Evil 1.5 as more of a heavy action game than even Resident Evil 2 ended up being, and is both very indicative of what Kamiya's style would be, and eventually where the series would ultimately end up focusing on with action horror. Also, just as a reminder, this is from what we currently know about the game, and most of this information came from early in the game's development. Any game developer will tell you that a game usually doesn't get good until the last 10% of the game's development, which is where Resident Evil 1.5 was just about to approach before it was finally canceled. So, why was it canceled? As some of you might already know, the game wasn't quite up to Shinji Mikami's standards. According to Mikami, well, if I had to compare it to making a stew, each ingredient was not bad. Good vegetables and good meat. At the time, I thought it would be a good stew if we threw everything into a pot and added a few spices. But after tasting it, I thought, what? What is this? I knew even if I let it cook, it would not be a good stew by a certain time. Hideki Kamiya himself had stated that it was his fault as a director due to his inexperience. He didn't have much of a vision with Resident Evil 2, and basically said okay to every idea that was presented to him. So while individually not every idea was bad, it lacked a cohesiveness that is vital to making a survival horror game. Though these issues were also the result of things that happened even before development on Resident Evil 1.5 had begun. The first of which was the departure of longtime designer and producer Takuro Fujiwara. Having been part of Capcom since 1985, having designed games like Ghosts and Goblins, and produced games like Little Nemo the Dream Master, and the critically acclaimed Mega Man X, Fujiwara was the one who pitched Resident Evil as a spiritual successor to Sweet Home. And he was one of the first of several major departures in Capcom's history. He left to start his own company, Whoopee Camp, which made Tomba, or Tombi, depending on your region, simply because he was frustrated with Capcom only wanting to produce sequels. Or have we heard this story before? Kenichi Iwao, the scenario writer for Resident Evil, had also left after the release of the original game. And listen, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Resident Evil is a masterpiece of narrative design, but this is actually a pretty big deal. Originally, Resident Evil didn't have a story at all. In Shinji Mikami's words, a haunted house doesn't need a story, and that a story was only better than nothing. And you know what? That is fair. Not every game needs a story. However, once you hear what Mikami was going to do, you'll be glad Iwao was there. I joined the project in mid-development. Originally, there were no humans in the game, just cyborgs. It was supposed to be a horror game still, but by having these Terminator-style characters, it wasn't scary at all. I decided to change up the characters. The initial draft had a mad scientist-like doctor who was doing freakish experiments. So say what you want about how crazy the whole evil pharmaceutical company was, it's still a major improvement and is what defines Resident Evil today. He did all of this in a game that was already in mid-development, essentially putting together what he could from what they already had. But beyond that, it was Kenichi Iwao's writing that effectively made Resident Evil the horror game it ended up being. He was the one responsible for the Itchy Tasty Journal, which as far as I'm concerned, is probably one of the best pieces of horror within Resident Evil as a series. But he wasn't just the writer, he was also an accomplished game designer himself. In fact, he was the one that brought the concept of limited resources such as ammo to Resident Evil, having been inspired by an MSX game called Alcazar: The Forgotten Fortress, which was a procedurally generated dungeon crawler that had little resources, forcing you to strategize on how to fight your enemies. Also, he wasn't the one that wanted live-action cutscenes in the original Resident Evil. That one fell on Shinji Mikami's shoulders.
No! Don't go!
Unfortunately, after the completion of Resident Evil, Iwao left to take a job at Squaresoft as a writer and director. He would go on to direct Einhander, which is the second time in a row that game has come up, and I swear it wasn't intentional. He would go on to direct and write Parasite Eve 2, and he would go on to write and plan for Final Fantasy XI. So, admittedly, I might be a little biased, but genuinely, Kenichi Iwao had contributed quite a bit to the success of the original Resident Evil. Those left to fill in a gap was Shinji Cyborg's and Mad Scientist Mikami and Hideki Kamiya, which, as stated before, had very little interest in horror. So knowing all this, you could really see the issues that Resident Evil 1.5 was struggling with. I'm not going to sit here and say it was bad, it was different and honestly refreshingly so. Shinji Mikami stated he wanted it to feel different than Resident Evil and have a different tone, so by all accounts it succeeded. While in presentation it does feel exactly like you would expect from a game in between Resident Evil 1 and 2, in terms of gameplay it looks more like what you would see in later games, and it would ultimately pave the way for the more action-focused direction the series would take. But overall, Resident Evil 1.5 just had too many problems. Again, most of this is speculative because we never seen the final version of the game, but it does seem like RE 1.5 lacked an overall direction. Gameplay-wise, while it might have certainly been tense to go against hordes of zombies, it wouldn't have exactly been scary. Either players would have been too limited on ammo and unable to deal with the hordes, meaning cheap deaths, and as we discussed before, death is the one thing that can kill survival horror. Or more likely, there would have been more ways to deal with them, no longer making groups of zombies feel like a threat, much less a single one. And with the new arsenal, it's hard to say whether new enemies would have posed much of a threat either. It might have been a perfectly serviceable action game, but the mechanics of survival horror such as tank controls and pre-rendered backgrounds don't really lend itself well to that genre. Likewise, it's hard to say whether the new environment would have fared much better. Shinji Mikami felt that the more modern style of police station was boring, with each environment looking too similar to each other. There weren't a whole lot of opportunities for interesting designs or puzzles like we found in Resident Evil 2. While I love the fact that a modern police station would give an attachment to reality, the truth is the strange puzzles and the macabre art style found in Resident Evil 2 ends up being a much more effective way at conveying horror due to the uncanny nature. Not to mention it felt more connected to the original. The Spencer Mansion was weird and filled with secrets, which gave it a lot of personality and is what made Resident Evil so memorable. However, there's only really one thing I could describe in Resident Evil 1.5, and it's this shot. And this is freaking amazing, but everything else is kind of forgettable. Overall, Resident Evil 1.5 seemed like a game with a lot of great ideas, just not a lot of good implementation or foresight. By this time, it was February 1997 and the game was to be out on store shelves in a couple of months. In an effort to salvage the game, the project supervisor, Yoshiki Okamoto, had brought in another writer. Though for some reason Capcom didn't have too many writers on staff, so they brought in Nobuo Sugimura. Sugimura was a successful writer for Japanese television shows like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider Black. As a bonus, he was also a fan of the first Resident Evil and gladly accepted the invitation. After having a chance to play the game, Sugimura told them what they most likely didn't want to hear. He felt the game's narrative just wasn't going to cut it. There was no real link between the events of the first and second game. He felt the game's story was too decisive. The setting was too realistic and sterile. On top of that, he agreed that the gameplay didn't have the same feeling of horror as the original. It didn't feel like Resident Evil. Sugimura had told Shinji and Kamiya that if they really wanted to do this right, they would have to start the project over. That was probably a very tough decision to make. Resident Evil 1.5 had spent over a year and a half in development, and they were set to release in just a couple months. Capcom had already spent a ton of money on advertisement on top of paying staff, and restarting meant they would probably spend another year in rushed development. Mikami had stated he even knew that Resident Evil 2 would sell even if they decided not to restart it. But he didn't want to release a poor product for a highly anticipated game. They eventually settled on a difficult decision. They would scrap and restart Resident Evil 1.5. Initially, the development team was upset to hear that the game they had worked on for so long was for nothing. Some of the staff had blamed the inexperience of Kamiya as a director, and a few went as far as asking for Kamiya to be replaced. Yet Mikami kept him on, knowing that Hideki Kamiya had learned something. During an interview with Satoru Iwata, Kamiya had stated, "It was really important that I received that chance, so I gave it a lot of thought of what had gone wrong. I was making decisions without a vision, and amidst all the pressures, I lowered my criteria for giving approval. And above all, it was important that I personally suffered the disastrous results of all that. In his own hindsight, Kamiya said that he was glad he was able to start over, because it allowed him to learn, and it ultimately made a better game than he would have otherwise made. And that game went on to be a major success, selling just under 5 million copies, and went on to become one of the best-selling games of the PlayStation. And on a more personal note, is probably my favorite game in the series. And while this isn't the end of the development of Resident Evil 2, this is where it stops with Resident Evil 1.5. RE2 is definitely deserving of its own video. However, if it wasn't for 1.5, we would have never had Resident Evil 2. In a way, you could say that 1.5 was the experience Kamiya needed, and gaining experience builds character. That would have been a great way to end the episode, wouldn't it? But there is still one last thing I gotta talk about, because I gotta give credit where credit is due. This video simply would not have been possible if not for the dedicated fans who saved all this information regarding the development of Resident Evil 1.5. From the game journalists who had the interviews, to those who scanned the articles and those who archived them, to those who have taken the time to translate them. It simply would not have been possible to keep a historic record without them. This doesn't apply just to Resident Evil 1.5. Nearly every video I do is accumulation of everyone's hard work and dedication for game preservation. However, 1.5 stands out in particular because the fan community did something amazing. They are the reason why you can play it today. For a long time, there was a belief that at some point there were copies of Resident Evil 1.5 around, based on the same builds that were shown to Shinji Mikami. These builds were said to have been distributed to Capcom USA to show off to gaming magazines and events. After the cancellation of 1.5, these discs would be effectively worthless for business, but incredibly valuable to game historians. Back then, Capcom was no stranger to leaks. The Resident Evil 2 beta was leaked by a Capcom employee, and a Game Fan magazine employee had burnt a copy of a preview build and sent it to a friend, which in turn made more copies that ended up on a Hong Kong black market. It was entirely possible that one of these scenarios could have seen a build of 1.5 out in the wild. And as it turns out, there was. Over the years, there have been a few people who have claimed to have had an early build. Some posted never-before-seen screenshots of 1.5, and there were just as many trolls and hoaxes about it. But there was at least some evidence that someone out there had a copy. Then, sometime in 2012, a group that called themselves Team iGas, or I Got a Shotgun, managed to get a build of 1.5. Due to some internet drama, and trust me, there is a lot of internet drama. A whole book could have been written about the internet drama. And in fact, there was a whole book written about the internet drama, written by someone within that internet drama, creating more internet. Anyway, someone managed to copy the build that the team had and was about ready to sell it on eBay, which caused Team iGas to release what they were calling Resident Evil 1.5 Magic Zombie Door, so that everyone could play it for themselves. Magic Zombie Door was based off a build of Resident Evil 1.5 that had been compiled sometime in November 1996, commonly referred to as the 40% build due to it being roughly 40% complete at the time. Team iGas's intention was to recreate what would have been most likely the final version of the game, or at least make the build that they did have playable. They had managed to find or recreate assets that would have been seen in more complete builds from screenshots and videos, and also managed to find a treasure trove of information in one of the demos of Resident Evil 2, most likely leftover data that Capcom never expected to be accessed, or even cared about. Most of the footage that you've seen here was from this version of the game. There's also another version called the Pure Vanilla build, which is essentially the game without the team's modifications, which is about as complete and playable as you would expect from a game in very early alpha. Supposedly there are other builds out there, including a known build that had been from further along during the game's development, sometimes referred to as the 80% build. This version was said to be beatable with Leon and had a lot more polish, but Unfortunately, this build most likely remains in the hands of a private collector who is more interested in preserving its monetary value than releasing it. There is also a good chance that Capcom still has the most complete version of 1.5. There is some circumstantial evidence that the inclusions of certain references and inspirations from 1.5 made it into the new Resident Evil 2 remake. They might have looked at some of the old files for information. Admittedly, there is even less of a chance of them releasing it. Still, there is always hope that these might fall into the hands of game preservationists someday. In the meantime, Team iGas had joined up with another indie developer who goes by the name Gemini, who has done a lot of work with the early Resident Evil PC ports. They have completed a new engine which will hopefully speed along development. Updates to 1.5 are few and far between nowadays, but it's said that they were keeping things quiet to avoid any potential issues with Capcom and the release of the RE2 remake. I wish them the best of luck, because we know just how volatile these fan projects can be. As for what Hideki Kamiya thought of the project, he had stated, "Honestly, no one needs to play through such a bad game." And while that might be true, it's still worth to experience a fascinating part of video game history. In gaining experience I just had a sense of deja vu. That would have been a great way to end the episode, wouldn't it? But there is still one last thing I gotta talk about because I gotta give credit where credit is due. A very special thanks to the people who made this video possible. If not for their financial support, I simply wouldn't be able to make videos like these. If you would like to see your name here and keep me being able to do what I do, then please consider supporting the channel. You can find out how to do that in the description below. But if you can't support financially, then I understand. You can always help the channel by liking, commenting, and if you haven't already, subscribing and hitting that bell. It puts me in YouTube's good graces and makes them recommend the video to others. I'll praise the algorithm. But if you're like me and don't necessarily trust an unthinking, uncaring robot, then consider sharing this video yourself. Or maybe one of these other 2 videos I made. My last video was on another 1998 classic, Brave Fencer Musashi. Or if you're more interested in hearing more about Hideki Kamiya after Resident Evil 2, check out this video on Akami. But most importantly, thank you very much for watching.